The movie begins with a train moving steadily along the tracks as passengers settle into their seats. Dr. Louis Shaler, a dedicated physician, is dozing in his seat with his young son Max beside him. Max tugs at Louis, begging him to play a game. Louis, half awake, agrees and they engage in a game of rock, paper, scissors. Their moment is interrupted when Louis receives a phone call. The noise in the carriage prompts him to step out into the corridor for some quiet. While on the phone, Louis notices Max chatting with a woman seated nearby. Max, in his excitement, accidentally spills a drink on the woman's clothes. Louis quickly ends his call and rushes back to offer her a tissue, apologizing. He also makes sure Max apologizes. The woman, understanding, assures him it's not a big deal and declines his offer to pay for the cleaning. As they settle back into their seats, Louis explains to Max that he has to stay with his grandmother because Louis has work. The woman, intrigued, asks about his profession. Louis briefly describes a challenging case involving a rare disease. Meanwhile, tension builds as a man lights a cigarette in the train. The conductor approaches to enforce the no-smoking policy, leading to a heated argument. Another passenger steps in to support the conductor, and eventually the smoker reluctantly throws his cigarette out, but not without hurling insults at both the conductor and the intervening passenger. Suddenly, a moment of panic ensues as Max opens the train door and nearly falls out. Louis, with quick reflexes, grabs him just in time. He initially scolds Max out of fear, but seeing his son's shock and fear, he softens his tone and reassures him gently. The conductor continues his rounds, checking tickets as the train journey resumes. On the train, Louis realizes that the woman he has been interacting with is gone. Max mentions that she hasn't said goodbye. They both then settle back to sleep. Meanwhile, after completing his rounds, the conductor moves to the corridor. Suddenly, he is grabbed by an unseen force. Despite his efforts to resist, he is ultimately overpowered and taken away. Louis gets up and sees that the woman has returned. They notice that they are the last passengers on the train. He asks her where she is getting off, and she replies, Tunbridge Wells. Louis mentions he is getting off at Tunbridge, noting it is the last chance for some rest, as he won't be able to sleep at work. The woman reveals she works in events management, describing it as boring, while Louis's job as a doctor sounds exciting and fulfilling to her. Louis explains that his work often results in sleepless nights. She then mentions she has abandoned his friends that night. She shares that her friends are trying to cheer her up after a recent breakup, organizing a night out in London. They joke about the rigors of partying, with Louis humorously noting that as a single dad, he can't imagine partying all night. The conversation takes a lighter turn when she playfully asks him to guess her medical condition, leading Louis to demonstrate his diagnostic skills, checking her for a heart murmur and explaining the process. As they continue to chat, the woman brings up the drink stain on her coat, jokingly suggesting that Louis buy her a new one with his doctor's salary. She offers to give him her number, introducing herself as Sarah Barwell. They banter about her handwriting. She then tells him to get some rest, promising to wake him before Tunbridge. When Louis suddenly wakes up, he realizes the train has stopped. He peers through the glass window but can't see anything outside. Seeing that Max is still asleep, he decides to wake Sarah and asks her to look after Max while he goes to find the conductor. As he makes his way through the train, he encounters a man and informs him that someone outside appears to be hurt. The man, dismissing the warning, suggests that Louis call an ambulance but insists there is nothing more he can do. Following the man's advice, Louis calls for an ambulance. When Louis returns, he finds Max and Sarah playing together. He tells Sarah that he has seen someone crawling by the tracks earlier, which makes them decide to search the train for the guard together. As they reach their destination, Louis and Max prepare to get off, saying their goodbyes. Sarah reminds Louis that he has her number and kisses him. However, the train doesn't stop, causing Louis and Max to miss their stop. A woman from the first-class carriage invites them to sit with her, and they accept. Determined to address the issue, Louis makes his way to the driver to inform him that the train has missed their stop. Louis calls to notify his colleague that he is stuck in a train. He then tries to communicate with the driver through an intercom. The driver asks how many passengers are left, and Louis tells him there are 6 passengers. Louis tries to tell him that he missed his stop and there is someone hurt at the trucks, but the driver stops replying. Louis starts knocking on the driver's door, trying to explain his urgency as a doctor needing to get to work. The man he has spoken to earlier approaches, questioning if Louis has found the guard. Louis mentions he has only found the guard's ticket machine and expresses concern about something being wrong with the driver. The man suggests the driver is simply ignoring Louis and indicates he would do the same. Suddenly, the train shakes violently. Louis pulls the emergency alarm, but there is no response. The man who has been questioning Louis also notices that the train has passed his stop, causing him to panic. The smoker from earlier, John, joins them. Lewis shares his earlier sighting of a man on the train tracks, which only heightens the tension. Peter, the older man, begins questioning John suspiciously, asking about his attire and if he works for the railway. Jan clarifies that he works as a cleaner for the London Underground and hasn't seen the guard recently. Peter introduces himself and Lewis, continuing to probe John for information. Jan, feeling accused, insists he hasn't been outside. Peter suggests that whoever let the air out of the brakes is likely the same person now driving the train, hinting at a sinister plot. The atmosphere grows increasingly tense as they grapple with the unfolding mystery and their growing fear. Sarah arrives, and Lewis immediately asks where Max is. She reassures him that Max is with Elaine. Lewis and Sarah then go to see if there is a way to activate the brakes. Jan joins them, inquiring if they are married. Peter appears and tells them to stop meddling, warning that the police are already in contact with the driver and have cautioned against any actions that might jeopardize their efforts to stop the train. Despite Peter's warnings, Lewis manages to open a door and they enter the compartment. Peter keeps urging them not to touch anything. Inside, they discover there is no brake mechanism to stop the train. Jan suggests they could jump out through a back door, but the others quickly dismiss the idea as too dangerous. As they continue searching, they find a handbrake and attempt to use it. The train begins to stop forcefully, causing sparks to fly as the wheels scrape against the tracks. However, the train suddenly accelerates again. In the ensuing chaos, Peter tries to stop them, but John punches him, pushing him away. Their desperate attempt to stop the train ultimately proves futile. They regroup with the others and begin discussing their next plan. Lewis reiterates that the driver has asked him how many passengers are left, suggesting something isn't right. Jan proposes breaking down the driver's door to force answers from him, but Peter sarcastically notes they would need a battering ram, suggesting they should just wait for the police instead. The group then speculates about their current location, believing they are approaching Stonegate. They discuss the possibility of a level crossing after Stonegate, buying them some time, but only if someone is expecting them. They debate whether the crossing is automatic or manual, concluding that if it is manual, it would depend on the driver to stop the train, assuming the brakes even worked. Peter points out the danger of hitting a car at the crossing, which could derail the train, a grim possibility Jan finds amusing. The seriousness of the situation sinks in as they realize that if they hit the crossing at 100 miles per hour, it could be catastrophic. Lewis suggests calling the police to ensure they are prepared for their arrival. They calculate that the level crossing is a couple of miles past the tunnel before the station, estimating they have about 80 seconds to figure things out at their current speed. The gravity of their predicament becomes painfully clear, and they brace themselves for the approaching danger. Peter keeps trying to contact the police, but their efforts seem futile. Meanwhile, Lewis focuses on keeping Max calm, with Sarah joining them and playing games to distract him. Suddenly, Lewis notices a police car outside, just as the train collides with a car crossing the tracks, causing a massive explosion. Elaine, overcome by the shock and stress, begins to feel unwell and eventually passes out. Lewis rushes to her side and discovers she is in cardiac arrest. He frantically searches her bag for medication, but finds nothing. Despite his best efforts to perform CPR, Elaine does not survive. Jan then approaches Lewis, insisting they need to break down the driver's door. Initially, Lewis is reluctant to give up on Elaine, continuing his attempts at CPR. However, the urgency of the situation and the others' insistence that they have to act forces Lewis to abandon his efforts and join them in their plan to confront the driver. Lewis picks up a fire extinguisher and tries to break down the door to the driver's cab, but his efforts are in vain. Jan then attempts to use a metal rod to break the door, but this also proves ineffective. Determined, Lewis starts smashing the glass window. Despite Jan's hesitation, Lewis climbs through the broken window and enters the compartment. Inside, Lewis finds the body of the conductor. He then notices a tinted glass panel and sees the driver's hand through it. Desperately, he begs the driver to stop the train and let the passengers off, but there is no response. Lewis then attempts to break the tinted glass, triggering an alarm. Ignoring the blaring sound, he continues his efforts to open the door, but his attempts with the metal rod are futile. They return to their seats, and Peter begins sharing what he has learned. He mentions that authorities are working on something further down the line and have found the driver, just as Lewis has described, on the tracks. The driver has been attacked by someone on the train. Lewis realizes he has seen the attacker earlier, recognizing his motorcycle helmet. He recalls that the man nearly got off at London Bridge, as if he has missed his stop. Peter theorizes that this This individual has killed the guard, dragged him into the compartment, pulled the emergency brake to release the air from the brakes, and then took over the driver's cab, throwing the driver out in the process. Peter then brings up the Moorgate crash from about 30 years ago, a tragic event on the Northern Line where a train accelerated into the buffers instead of slowing down, killing the driver and 40 other passengers. The cause was never definitively proven, but there was speculation that it was a case of driver self-crushing. They find a manual and try to find a way to stop the train. Jan explains a method to do it, but Peter is skeptical. Jan mentions he has graduated in engineering, trying to reassure the others. He then announces his intention to go outside the train, prompting immediate concern from everyone else, who warn him it is deadly. Peter interjects, explaining that after Crowhurst, trains typically slow down due to poor track conditions all the way to Hastings. Peter suggests that if Jan is determined to go outside, he should wait until after Crowhurst, when the train would be forced to reduce speed. Jan argues that the current driver will not slow down, speculating that the driver intends to derail the train. Peter agrees, noting that the driver seems like he wants to leave his own life, but doubts he would want to die in an unremarkable location. They all sit down, deciding to wait while discussing their personal lives to pass the time. As they approach Crowhurst, John prepares to go outside and uncouple the train carriages. He begins his task, but is interrupted by the sudden approach of a single-track tunnel. Lewis acts quickly, saving John by pulling him back on board just seconds before the train enters the tunnel. Inside, they try to calm John down after the harrowing experience. Suddenly, the train comes to a halt, but they find they can't open the doors to get out. It turns out that the police have set up an ineffective blockade of sandbags, which only temporarily stops the train. The narrow clearance of the tunnel prevents any of the passengers from opening the doors and escaping, leaving them trapped inside. Suspecting they are now close to a deadly crash at the Hastings station buffers, Lewis decides to create an improvised explosive using the last remaining fire extinguisher. The explosion successfully destroys the floor panels, giving them access to the coupler. Peter volunteers to detach it, but tragically, he accidentally falls through the gap and is killed. The burning carriages separate, speeding through a suburban station as helpless police officers watch. Lewis remains in the front car and instructs Jan to use the rear handbrake to stop their section. Jan and Sarah manage to halt their carriage using the handbrake. With the train leaking fuel and continuing to burn around him, Lewis takes a moment to compose himself. Summoning his courage, he runs and leaps from the carriage just as the entire vehicle explodes behind him. The movie concludes with Sarah and Max rushing to Lewis and finding him alive and conscious. Relieved and emotional, they embrace him. Jan joins them shortly after, and they all sit together, reflecting on the harrowing experience they have just survived, grateful to be alive and reunited.